Thanks, Neil. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but every year the Oxford Dictionary adds on average 900 new words to the English language. Now, some of these words are very self-explanatory. So one of the more recent words is the word sharknado, which is obviously a tornado of sharks. Another word that has been added recently, you may not have heard of, is the word misgendered. Now, misgendered, what does this mean? It means if a biological male wants to identify as a female and you don't refer to them as a female, you are said to have misgendered them. So I heard a comedian this week who got into trouble recently for misgendering a baby. He said he was standing in line behind this mother and her child, and he pointed out, he said, "Oh, look, your baby has dropped her toy." And the mother looks at him and says, "His toy? Thank you very much. It is clearly a boy because he's wearing blue." And the comedian said the best part of that conversation was that the mother was wearing a blue blouse. And so he said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, sir. I did not mean to ruin this lovely father-son moment." Now, while it's important to see the humour in all of this, there actually is a dark side to it. So about 5 months ago, there was a case of a barista in England who got fired from their job because they lost it at a customer who had accidentally misgendered them. The clip went viral. Now, add to that a recent survey in the US that said over 40% of millennials think that you should be prosecuted if you misgender someone. You should be charged. So how did we get here? Well, I want to suggest to you this morning it has to do with the identity formation process that Western culture imposes on us. Now, that's a big phrase. Let me explain what I mean. So the word identity, it basically means a person's sense of self and a person's sense of worth. Okay, so who are you across all your various relationships and situations in life? And how do you validate your worth, your value as a person? All right, so that's what an identity is. It's a person's sense of their self and a person's sense of their worth. And what I'm suggesting to us today is that Western society imposes a process of forming said identity that has left Western people with a very brittle sense of identity, a very fragile sense of their self and their worth. Now, please don't hear me singling out Western culture as being extra heinous or extra insidious in imposing an identity formation process on us. Every culture does this. What do I mean? I mean, at no time in human history has a primary school teacher ever sat their class down and said, "Okay, class, what we're going to do today is we're going to figure out how to form our identities." Like, did anyone ever have that subject in school? No, we have no idea what they're talking about, all right? We don't teach people how to figure out who they are. Cultures simply push that onto us. And they do so in a way that not only do we not realise it's happened to us, but also we don't even know that there's a different process available. And so what I want to do today is to make this identity formation process visible to us. I'm going to show us what's actually going on behind the scenes and show us how different cultures push us to form our identities in particular ways. And the reason I want to do this is to compare these cultural identity processes with the Christian religion. All right, so what we've been doing across the month of October is we've been looking at 4 things humans need to thrive in life. All right, and they are hope, satisfaction, meaning, and identity. And what we've been seeing, what we've been arguing, is that the Christian religion offers us a more certain hope, more lasting satisfaction, and a more durable meaning in life. And if you want to know about those topics, the sermons are on our website. But today, what I want to argue is that Christianity offers us a more resilient identity than what Western culture has given us. And I've got three simple points to help us see that. You can see that on the inside of your news sheet, all right? So we're going to begin by looking at how cultural identity is formed. Like, how is it that our culture says we should form our own identities, build our own identities? That's point one. We're then going to look at why cultural identity formation is actually weak. We're going to look at what's wrong with it. And then we're going to conclude by turning to the Bible and seeing where strong identity formation is found. Now, this is a deep topic. It's a hard topic. We're going to need our thinking caps on. But at the end, I'm going to open it up for questions. So if there's anything I don't cover, shoot me a question and I'll see if I can answer it for us. But until then, let's dive in and see how to build a more resilient identity. Now, like I said, most people don't actually know identity formation is happening to them. All right? We're never taught how to do this. It just happens. And so to go up to someone in the street and say, how did you form your identity? It's probably like asking a fish about the water, right? If we could ask a fish, how's the water today? The fish would probably look at us and go, what's water? Like, it's just the thing that's all around us, okay? So only psychologists and sociologists are actually able to tell us how we get our identity as humans. But in order to make this process a bit more visible to us, like I said, it's going to take our thinking caps for 2 or 3 minutes. So strap in. All right, so firstly, identity is first and foremost who we are at our very core. Right? What is the bottom line of who I am and what I'm living for? So if I was to take myself, for example, you could say that I'm a male, I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I'm a minister. Right? You could say that that's my identity. But alongside that, where does my value in that come from? Right? What am I asking? I'm asking, who do I give authority to determine whether I'm a good man or a bad man, a good husband or a bad husband, a good minister or a bad minister, all right? And that's what our identity is. It is our sense of self and our sense of worth. But how does one form their own personal identity? Well, there's a Catholic philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor who wrote a book several years ago making this whole process visible. He's telling us how it's done. And the book's called Sources of the Self, if you want to look it up. And in it, he says there are 2 main schools of thought as to how cultures push identity formation onto their people. All right, so there's the traditional form and there's the modern form. Now, the traditional view, this is what ancient cultures all followed, and there's quite a few traditional cultures today that still follow this, like Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures. They're very traditional. And for traditional cultures, one's identity is all about honour. All right, the bottom line for traditional cultures, the greatest thing to live for is honour. And this honour comes from how you serve your family, your community, your nation, and your God. This is what traditional cultures think is important. You need to serve. It's all about duty. So the speaker at the women's event we had 2 weeks ago, she gave us a perfect example of this from Greek culture. Okay, Greek culture is a traditional culture. And she said when the Greeks get together for a relo bash, what happens is each of the aunties is asked to make their signature dish. Okay, and you bring your signature dish along, and that gets pride of place on the buffet for when everyone's coming to eat. And if someone makes the same dish as you, and that's your signature dish, their dish gets pushed all the way up the back. All right? And here's the thing, people will praise you, they will lift you up, they will validate you on how well you made your signature dish today. Right? That's a traditional cultural formation. Now, that's for the women, all right? For the men, in Greek cultures, it's a little different, okay? For the women, it's all about hospitality. For the men, it's about providing for your family. One of the first jokes I heard when I came to Little Greece, Earlwood, was, what do you call a Greek with 3 houses? Lazy, all right? You've got to have at least 4 or 5 houses to be a proper Greek man. And so in traditional cultures, your identity comes from how you sacrifice your own interests and your desires for your family or your community or your nation or your God. And these communities, they are your validators. Okay? They're the ones that tell you whether you're honourable or not, whether you've sacrificed enough for your community or not. All right, so that's traditional cultures. It's all about honour. Then comes the modern culture, the Western culture, and it's not about our duties to our community, all right? Modern culture imposes a different identity formation process, which is all about our own dreams and desires, all right? That's what modern culture says. It's postmodernism 101. Postmodernism says there's no such thing as moral absolutes anymore. So your family or your community or your God cannot tell you what to do, all right? What you need to do is you need to look within yourself and determine your own dreams and aspirations. But on top of that, you determine for yourself what is good or bad, all right? You are your own validator. And so if you look within yourself and you determine that you are a non-binary, pansexual, two-spirited wolf, then that's good for you. That's a good thing, according to modern culture. Now, just so you know, this has never happened in human history before. All right? Western culture is the first culture to tell us that our self-worth comes not from what our community imposes on us, but from the dignity that we bestow upon ourselves. All right, it's never happened before. Okay, now we can take our thinking caps off. The hard work has been done. We've looked at these two cultural formation techniques, all right, processes, and we're doing so because if we want a more resilient identity, we need to understand how identities are formed in our various cultures. But the fascinating thing about Western culture, modern culture, is it's not a different identity formation process to the traditional ones. It's actually the complete reverse of traditional cultures, all right? I'll explain what I mean. You see, traditional identity formation starts on the outside. It looks at what your community says is good, and then it goes on the inside, and you speak to your heart, and you say, well, look, this is what we need to live for. This is what our identity needs to be. The modern culture starts on the inside. And it says, this is who I am, this is what my heart says, all right? This is what's good for me. And then we go outside and we tell the culture that they need to validate me and honour me for who I am. So that's how cultural identity formation happens. The next step is to critique these cultural identity formation processes. Right? We want to know if they're good or bad. And look, each of them has their strengths and weaknesses. So I'll give you an example. Western individualism, for all its faults, does have some advantages to it. All right? So in many traditional cultures, you marry who your family tells you to marry. And your job is the job your family tells you to work at. Right? So there's a lot of benefit in being able to choose your own spouse or choose your own job. One of the advantages of traditional cultures is there's less divorce, all right? Because getting a divorce would bring shame on your family, most children in traditional cultures grow up with both parents in the house. That's a huge advantage. So all cultures have redeeming qualities about them, but they also have significant flaws. All right? And what I want us to see is how both traditional and modern identity formation processes produce very fragile, very weak identities, and in particular, the modern Western one. So firstly, both identities are very crushing. Right? Traditional identities are all about fitting in. And if you don't fit in for your cultural norms, then it will be made clear to you by your community that you're not living up to standard. And that can be very crushing, particularly for teenagers and young adults who are trying to figure out who they are. But at the same time, modern identities are all about standing out. All right? So if you're conforming to some social standard, or worse still, some religious standard, then you're a sellout. You have to stand out from the pack. So you can't just be a non-binary. You've got to be a non-binary, pansexual, two-spirited wolf. They're both very crushing. Second, both identities are very judgmental. That's just how they work. What I mean is they both tell us that our value as a person comes from comparing ourselves to others. And so whatever we choose as the benchmark for our identity, we will look down on others who don't measure up to that benchmark. Right? So, for example, if your identity is found in being a successful businessman or in being a homemaker, then you will look down on those who are struggling in those areas. That's actually what we saw in our passage that Neil read before. Okay, the Pharisee prided himself on being a very moral, upstanding citizen. That was his identity. And so he looked down on the wicked tax collector who wasn't living up to that standard. All right, cultural identities are very judgmental. Third, they're both very fragile. Right, so with traditional identities, we feel very strong, we feel very proud when we're living up to our community standards. But what happens when we fail? What happens when we lose our job? Or if we burn the moussaka or the galaktabuktello? What is it? Galaktabuktello. I knew I'd get that wrong. Budiko. Galaktabudiko. Got there in the end. Thank you to one of my Greek aunties. It's very crushing when you don't live up to standard. Same with the Western way of doing things, but it's even worse, all right? And the reason it's worse is because as humans, we're very relational beings, okay? What this means is, try as we might, we cannot actually validate ourselves, all right? It's one of the lies of Western society. We cannot be our own validators. We need to negotiate our identity in dialogue with others. Now, this is partly why Westerners are slaves to consumerism. Right? Because our identities are so fragile, so weak, we are in constant need of validation from others. And so we buy all the fashionable clothes, or the expensive makeup, or the fast sports car, or the expensive watch. What are we doing? We're trying to show others that we're worth it. Look at me, look at who I am. But even worse than that is it means that we demand that society validates our own internal identity, all right? So that transgender barista that I mentioned before, he got verbally and physically violent with someone simply for misgendering them. Why? Because we cannot validate our own identity. And so what we do now is we demand that others validate our identity. All right? You will refer to me as however I want to be referred to. Cultural identities are very fragile. Fourthly, cultural identities are actually tearing our culture apart. So postmodernism tells us there is no absolute truth, right? And whatever's truth for you is true. But what this has led to is that there is no moral or political good that anyone can agree on anymore. Now, add to that our already fragile identities, and what you end up is people demanding not just that you validate my own personal identity, but you need to validate what I believe culturally or politically as well. And so if you stand on the other side of the aisle, whether you're conservative or progressive, you're not just wrong in not validating what I believe, you're actually immoral. You see, Western cultural identity is partly responsible for the current disintegration of Western civilization. It has produced people with very brittle identities who need everyone else to validate their views. Right? So that's what is wrong with cultural identity formation. It is crushing, it is judgmental, it is fragile, and it is disintegrating our culture as we speak. So here's the question. What do we do? What I'd like to do in our final point is show how Christianity offers an identity formation process that produces much more resilient identities. And if that's something that is appealing to you, perhaps you need to look into this, all right? And so to see this, I want to invite you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. So if you've got your pew Bibles there, Turn to page 1773. I'll give you a few moments. So it's 1773. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's talking about identity. So if you're on page 1773, you'll see a big 4 halfway down. If you go down about 7 or 8 lines from that, you'll see a little 3. This is 1 Corinthians 4, verse 3. Paul says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Now, notice what Paul's doing here. Firstly, he is rejecting the traditional identity formation process. He says, I care very little if I'm judged by you or any human court. Why? Right? Why doesn't he care about what his community is telling him? It's because culture can get it wrong. Right? So he says, I don't need culture to tell me what to do, and I don't need my culture to validate me. But at the same time, Paul rejects the modern identity formation process too. I don't even judge myself. Okay, he rejects any internal influence upon his identity. So whether his heart tells him you're a terrible sinner or you're a wonderful humanitarian, he ignores it. The reason being, our conscience can get it wrong too. Culture can get it wrong. Our conscience can get it wrong. Our conscience will often tell us that we're innocent when really we're not. But this leaves Paul with a big problem. Well, if I'm not going to get my identity from my culture, and if I'm not going to get my identity from internally, where does my identity come from? And his answer, it is the Lord who judges me. Right? He still needs validation. We can't validate ourselves. But no human, no human is able to actually give us the level of validation we need. Like, how many spouses have been crushed under the weight of the partner's need for validation? You see, no human can ever give enough love or enough compliments or enough sex to make the other person feel okay about themselves. We just don't have it in us as humans. And so what does Paul do? He looks to God for his validation. It is the Lord who judges. And look, this is the heart of our theme today. If you only take one thing away from today, this is what I want you to take away. The way we form a strong identity, right? The kind of identity that does not demand that others validate me on my looks or my success or my sexuality, is by letting the Lord judge me. Now, having said that, you have to be a Christian for this to work. You have to be in a relationship with Jesus to build this resilient identity. The reason being, if you let the Lord judge you outside of a relationship with him, it will be even more crushing than the traditional or the modern cultural identity formation, right? Why is this? It's because his judgment is we have sinned against him. Every single one of us, right? And deep down, we know this. We know we're not perfect. And that's why we are all trying to manage our own guilt, right? How do you manage your guilt? You ever thought about that? There's many ways we do it, right? So some people manage their guilt by lowering the bar to 50%. I think I can just get over 50%. Some people become very religious to try and make up for their sin. Some people focus on their strengths. Well, at least I'm not a murderer. I'm okay. We manage our guilt by finding it in our heart to forgive ourselves. Aren't we nice? We medicate our guilt through alcohol or work or sex or gambling. Some people deal with their guilt by going and talking to a counsellor so that the counsellor can tell us we're okay. We manage our guilt through self-flagellation, right, making up for our sin. Some people assume that God is super forgiving while others just assume he doesn't exist at all. This is how humans try to manage our guilt because we know we're sinful. We're all trying to do this, and that's God's judgment on us too. But here's the thing. When you get into a relationship with Jesus, that all changes. And it changes dramatically. Now, let me explain. One of the best places to see this is in Jesus' very first miracle. Now, let me ask you, if you were making up a religion, all right, and you wanted people to follow this religious leader who performs miracles, what would be the first miracle you make up? Well, I guarantee you, it would not be turning water into wine, unless that's what actually happened. So John chapter 2 tells the true story, it really happened, of when Jesus went to a wedding that ran out of wine at the reception. And the passage tells us that it was the bridegroom's job to supply the wine, right? You had one job, blew it. And so Jesus' mother comes to him and says, look, they've got no more wine. And Jesus says a very curious thing. He says, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. Now, Jesus' hour in John's gospel is his crucifixion. Okay, so various times throughout John's gospel we hear Jesus' hour has not yet come, his hour has not yet come. And on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus says, my hour has come. Now, here's the question that has stumped scholars for centuries. Why does Jesus talk about his crucifixion when his mum's talking about the catering? Well, we realise the reason when we understand that running out of wine at your own wedding is very dishonouring. Right? This bridegroom is about to bring disgrace upon himself and his entire family. It is a traditional culture. And honour is the rule of the day. And so when Mary says they have no more wine, what she's really saying is, please take this man's disgrace away. And so Jesus' reply, good woman, what he's basically saying is, what do you think I've come to do? The whole reason I've come to earth is to take my people's disgrace away. Right? And that's what happened at the cross. Jesus took all the sin, all the guilt, all the disgrace of his people, and he put it on himself. And the moment you become a Christian, that's what happens to you. All your sin and your disgrace is taken away and put on Jesus. But it doesn't stop there. All right? When Jesus turns the water into wine, do you know who gets the credit? We read it a little later in the passage. The bridegroom gets the credit. He is praised for this wonderful vintage that he brought out at the end. Right? And this is also how it works when you become a Christian. Jesus doesn't just take your disgrace away, he replaces it with his honour. God looks upon you as just as beautiful, just as sinless, just as righteous, just as honorific as God the Son. Can you imagine that? Imagine what that does for your identity. Now, friends, when we stop and let that sink in, it changes everything. It changes our identity. In the most recent John Wick movie, I'm not telling you to rush out and watch it, but he's asked, what do you want on your headstone? What does that mean? He's asking, what is your identity? And he says, I want beloved husband on my headstone. That's a pretty good identity. But imagine what would happen if our identity was beloved child of God. That's the most resilient identity there is, because even death can't take it away from you. And we don't need those around us to validate us, because he has. All right? And the beauty of this identity is it makes us stop. It means we don't look down on others like the Pharisee did, because we know that Jesus had to die for my sins. I know I'm sinful. But also, knowing that Jesus was willing to die, it gives us, and that gives us his honour. Well, there's nothing more validating in that than all the world. So if you want a resilient identity, please come and speak to me. after this about how we can care very little if we are judged by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. It is the Lord who judges me.